So a quick rundown of the agenda. We wanted to provide Representative Muns, who is a member of the Commission to Study Environmentally Triggered Chronic Illnesses and is the chair for the Subcommittee on Coakley Landfill, an opportunity to provide some opening remarks and comments. So Representative Muns, it's all yours.
Great. Thank you. Yes, my name is Chris Muns. I am a state rep from Hampton and a member of the commission, and it's a mouthful to say, so I won't try to say it again, but the commission that Drew referred to. I want to thank New Hampshire DES, in particular Mike Wimsett and Drew Hoffman, for organizing this meeting, and also thank EPA, in particular Skip Hull and Alan Brooks from the New Hampshire Department of Justice for agreeing to participate. So I want to welcome to them and welcome to all of you that have taken time out of your evening to join us. When I was appointed to the commission, I had very little knowledge of the issues surrounding the Coakley landfill and the work that had been done to date. I want to personally thank everyone for their patience with me, in particular Mike and Drew, who have had to spend probably too much time bringing yet another state representative up to speed, or try to get him up to speed. So thank you for that. There's been a great deal of work that has been done to address the contaminants from the Coakley landfill since it was declared a Superfund site in, I believe, 1983, and also since the Coakley landfill group was formed and entered into an a consent decree with EPA and New Hampshire DES and other parties. The concern about those contaminants has, however, not gone away, particularly since a cluster of cancer cases was discovered on the seacoast in areas near the Coakley landfill. Those concerns have only increased as the public has become more aware of the prevalence of PFAS chemicals and substances, throughout our environment. In 2019, the New Hampshire legislature tried to address at least some of those concerns by enacting House Bill 494, which specified that implementation of a remedy to contaminants from Coakley landfill should be completed, or at least begun, by September 1st of 2020. And the plan, the idea was that an implementation plan would be agreed to by all the parties, and then implementation would begin by that date. Nearly 4 years later, that effort has not yet begun, which I would be lying has it has resulted in some concern among not only members of the legislature, but the public. And while that is unfortunate, that's water over the dam. There's not much that we can do about that right now. And in the conversations that I've had with DES, the one thing that I've tried to impress upon them is that what's important now is that we understand, what the current state of affairs is at the landfill, and with efforts to address contaminants coming from the landfill. And probably most importantly, what is the plan going forward? And hopefully we can be as specific as possible in terms of specific next steps that are going to take place. That's what I hope we can. That's what I hope we can accomplish tonight. Last December, DES produced a report that provided an update and kind of a state of where things stand. I and other members of the subcommittee that I chair and also the broader commission, we did have some questions that we shared with DES. And I think a copy of that report and a copy of the questions was forwarded to you all along with the invitation that you received. My hope is that tonight, the presenters can answer some of those questions. But again, the most important thing from my perspective is that we come away at the end of the evening with a much better sense of where things are and where things are going, particularly in light of some of the new standards that EPA has just recently announced. I think it's really important that not only those of us in the legislature and those of us that are serving as public officials in the adjacent towns have an understanding of where we're going, but that we can satisfy the public that any concerns that they might have about what's happening at the Coakley landfill, are being addressed or will be addressed very shortly. So with that, again, thank you very much to our presenters, and I'll turn it back to Drew, who has to unmute himself.
I sure do. Thank you, Chris. And I share your hope that we can accomplish at least some of the items that you hope to achieve this evening. Of course, regulatory wise, we maybe don't move as fast as you would like, but we're certainly doing all we can. So a quick rundown of the agenda, and let me just say up front, our intention is to really minimize talking to you in presentation mode here and really getting to your questions and discussion points. So, but we have some upfront items here. I'll provide some introductions of agency representatives that are here tonight and ask that they, if they don't already have their camera on, turn them on in just a minute and then raise their hands to identify them so you can see them and put a face to the name. We'll do a site orientation and a site activity update as well as next steps. I'll cover that piece, then I'll hand it off to EPA, my counterpart there, Skip Hull. Will provide an update on the PFAS MCLs and hazardous substance listing and everything that propagates from that. That will then lead us directly into the questions and discussions. Our main objective is, as Chris, you mentioned, is to address the subcommittee's comments and questions and concerns relative to the December 2023 NHDES letter. So first to introductions, and if you would all turn your cameras on, we have Richard Hall, Skip Hall, Remedial Project Manager, New Hampshire, Rhode Island Superfund Section. Melissa Taylor, New Hampshire, Rhode Island Superfund Section Chief. Courtney Carroll, Human Health Risk Assessor with EPA. Aaron Shaheen, Community Involvement Coordinator. Cindy Lewis, the Manager of the Office of Regional Counsel, Superfund and Site Remediation Branch of EPA. And Ruth Ann Sherman, EPA. I don't think Ruth Ann's with us. That may have been a mistake. Also Enforcement Counsel. And from DES, we have Amy Russo, who you've already met, is serving as moderator, also the PFAS Response Coordinator. Mike Wimsat, Director of the DES Waste Management Division. Jeff Martz, Hazardous Waste Remediation Bureau Administrator. Myself, Project Manager of Coakley Landfill. Drew Hoffman. Karen Craver, Administrator of the Environmental Health Program. And John Patali, Human Health Risk Assessor within the Environmental Health Program. Alan Brooks, Senior Assistant Attorney General. And Jim Sukup, Weston Solutions Project Manager and Technical Consultant to both the agencies, EPA and DES. So for everyone's benefit, for those that aren't very well oriented to the site, thought it worthwhile to provide a brief summary of what we have out here. The Coakley landfill located somewhat central here in North Hampton predominantly, and the yellow arrows represent predominant groundwater flow direction from east to west. As well, and then reaching a bedrock trough, which is the primary groundwater flow path from the site, west of the site, and bifurcating to the north and the south. Certainly, by all data that we have, it certainly suggests that the predominant direction is to the north into Barry's Brook and groundwater going to the north as well. But we do have groundwater impacts and to a limited extent, surface water impacts to the south. Then we have, moving around clockwise here, we have a new southern boundary well that is being constructed as we speak. And this is a well couplet. It's a bedrock and overburden well intended to confirm compliance of the southern groundwater management zone boundary, which is identified by the pink line around the site and beyond. We have a Woodknoll Drive and Birch Road neighborhood to the south. And moving up to the northwest, we have Ridgecrest Drive, Skyline Drive, and September Drive neighborhoods, Falls Way as well. And then to the north is Breakfast Hill Road, the Breakfast Hill Golf Clubhouse and Golf Course, Stone Meadow Way neighborhood, and Berry Farm Lane adjacent to that. The Rye landfill, otherwise known as the Breakfast Hill landfill, located in Rye, just over the mound there on Breakfast Hill Road on the east side of that. And that brings us around. So work is continuing at the site to address data gaps identified in the Deep Bedrock Investigation Final Report. This work includes construction of monitoring wells within existing open bedrock boreholes, in addition to completing the southern boundary well that I pointed out in the previous slide. An evaluation of the presence of site contaminants to the east of the landfill is also being investigated. And finally, surface water groundwater interactions are being studied and are further defined here to offer perspective of the scope of this effort, as it may be the most pertinent to this evening's discussion. Additional data needs include temperature profiling of groundwater discharges to surface water using infrared aerial scanning technologies, seepage meter deployment to estimate contaminant flux from groundwater to surface water, and use of data loggers to assess groundwater flow conditions. The Coakley Landfill Group, otherwise known as CLG, is also continuing to collect data to assess PFAS loading from the landfill cap to local groundwater and wetlands. And finally, this data will be used to further inform the evaluation of remedial alternatives to mitigate contaminant loading to local wetlands, including Barry's Brook. Moving forward, we anticipate data collection and reporting of the data gap components previously mentioned over the next year, in addition to addressing needed modifications of the groundwater management zone, or GMZ. NHDES has recently kicked off a PFAS treatment incentive program intended to remove PFAS from municipal landfill leachate discharges to publicly owned treatment works. The Coakley Landfill Group is considering participation in this program that can provide incentives for PFAS treatment technology development and application at this site. As Skip Hall will be discussing next, we will be evaluating the implications of EPA's MCLs for PFAS in the coming months. And with that, I'll pass it off to Skip Hall.
Thanks, Drew. Let me share what I have and we'll get going. Everyone seeing that?
Yes.
Great. Good evening. As Drew mentioned and introduced me, my name is Skip Hull. I am the EPA project manager for the Coakley Landfill Superfund Site. I've started with a list of our EPA participants, but we've already gone over that. Some of those folks may be replying to specific questions as we move along, depending on the area of expertise. Is everyone hearing me okay? Or I guess indicate if not.
Yep.
I want to start with an update on EPA's recent announcement on regulations associated with PFAS. As I'm sure many of you know, EPA has recently announced regulatory changes regarding the contaminants known as per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS. These include the announcement of a final national primary drinking water regulation establishing maximum contaminant levels, or MCLs, and maximum contaminant level goals, or MCLGs, for a number of PFAS compounds. MCLs in drinking water with this rule were set at 4 parts per trillion, and an MCLG was set at 0 parts per trillion for PFOA and PFAS individually. MCLGs and MCLs for PFHX, PFNA, and GenX chemicals were set at 10 parts per trillion. A regulatory threshold was also established for mixtures of these chemicals using a measure of risk called a hazard index. This table is just showing what I just cited as the new standards for PFOA and PFAS at 4 parts per trillion, PFHXS, PFNA, and GenX chemicals at 10 parts per trillion. And the web address you see here is to EPA's Safe Drinking Water Act website associated with everything PFAS and these new regulations and standards. In addition, EPA has designated PFOA and PFAS as hazardous substances under the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation and Liability Act, or CERCLA, which is the law that's established for cleaning up Superfund sites. This provides EPA added authority for regulating the reporting of releases of these contaminants and for the investigation and cleanup of these contaminants at Superfund sites. I do want to stress that the Safe Drinking Water Act MCLs are standards that apply to drinking water supplies, but they can be adopted as cleanup levels at Superfund sites where groundwater may be used for drinking. Regional screening levels, or RSLs, are risk-based numbers that are calculated using toxicity data for specific contaminants. These are not enforceable standards like MCLs, but are used at Superfund sites to determine if a contaminant is a concern and should be investigated further. We use the toxicity information for these RSLs to then calculate a risk-based site-specific screening level for contaminants at the Coakley Landfill site. I mention all this because based on the new toxicity information that was used to calculate the Safe Drinking Water Act MCLs, the site-specific screening levels for Coakley Landfill will be recalculated and will likely be lower than the previous levels, which may impact the determination of risk in surface water at the site. EPA will be recalculating these screening levels this month in May. And I wasn't going to go through this slide in any detail, but it's just to highlight the screening levels that we had in place for media at Coakley Landfill, including for surface water, fish tissue consumption, and groundwater. The green highlighted boxes are the previous values for PFAS and PFOA. And these are the values that will likely change based on the new toxicity information. And again, those are the numbers we use for screening. They're not regulatory standards that are enforceable. Monitoring data for surface water that's collected semi-annually at the site will be compared against the new values, and a determination will be made of whether or not there is an unacceptable risk. Moving on to kind of next steps in general and specific to Coakley, the new Safe Drinking Water Act regulations are effective 60 days from the Federal Register notice, which I believe was last Friday, putting that effective date at about June 25th. The CERCLA hazardous substance regulations have not been published in the Federal Register, but will also be effective 60 days following publication. But EPA is already assessing the impact of these new regulations on Superfund sites on a site-by-site basis to determine if action is required based on any change to risk and protectiveness. New screening levels for Coakley will be calculated in May for PFOA and PFAS in surface water and fish tissue. As mentioned, these new regulations provide further authority under Superfund to require additional work to address specific contaminants as necessary and to determine if PFAS compounds should be adopted as contaminants of concern or COCs at Coakley. As Drew discussed, there's already work ongoing to determine the extent of PFAS contamination at Coakley and to consider pilot tests for treatment of contaminated runoff from the landfill cap. EPA and New Hampshire DES have initiated conversation with the Coakley Landfill Group regarding what action may be required to address these new regulations at Coakley and address the new regulations and the screening levels, including the possibility of providing alternative water to those homes with private wells that now exceed MCLs, the new MCLs, and the possibility of enhancing signage for areas of impacted surface water as required. With that, that's the extent of my update. I'll pass it back to Drew for kick off our Q&A and provide some instructions on that.
Thank you, Skip. So as Amy mentioned in the front end of the meeting, you can now feel free to enter questions directly in the chat box, or if you would like to speak and to us directly, feel free to raise your hand. Of course, when speaking, unmute and turn on your camera if you would, and announce yourself and your affiliation.
All right, we do have a question in the chat from Mindy Mesmer. She's asking how many private wells will exceed the new MCLs?
Skip, would you like to?
Yes, I'll take that. Thanks for that question, Mindy. We have looked at the historic data. A little bit of background. There's numerous private wells around the Coakley landfill area that have been sampled over time. Some have been sampled as part of the Coakley Landfill Group's routine monitoring program. Those have been sampled twice a year since, I think, the fall of 2017, maybe. So we have a pretty good data set. And looking at those wells that have both that have exceeded the new MCLs at some point in time, may not be currently exceeding, but have exceeded at some point in time. There are 11 private wells by our count. That does not include 4 private wells that have already been addressed and were previously determined to have been impacted by the landfill, to have been provided with point of entry treatment systems in their homes, to have one has been connected to private water or public water, and one is not in use, but the home is being renovated and will be connected to public water.
All right, Representative Muns?
Yeah, thank you. I wonder if someone could talk to the scope of the consent decree that was signed, and what it covers and what it might not cover. I think the specific question I have is, when a consent decree was signed, I don't know that too many people were focused on PFAS. I don't know that it was on too many people's radar screen. And given that that's now something that has come up as a concern, is that covered under the consent decree? So maybe, I hope that makes sense.
Cindy Lewis, is that something you'd be prepared to address, at least generally?
I'm not prepared to answer that specifically, as I'm covering for the site attorney that typically works on this matter, but we could certainly get back to you with an answer at a later time.
Yeah, I guess what I'm trying to understand is, to what extent, to what extent will EPA, DES have the ability to implement certain things that are new things that have come to light in the last 20 or so years, or is there a potential that that will run afoul of the consent decree and therefore nothing can happen?
No, new conditions can be addressed under language in the consent decree. So, we look at, as Skip was talking, we would explaining, we would be looking at the risk posed by a new contaminant and determining whether or not, because of a new regulation, new conditions, and the new risk that's posed, whether or not it should be open to address and include this. So yes,
Okay.
it's possible.
Thank you.
All right, I don't see any other questions or hands at this time, but feel free. Oh, there we go. Mindy has another question. What is the status of the investigations on the east side into Rye?
I'll take that one. I touched on that briefly there in the update. That has multiple components involved, of which are laid out in work plans, or really probably more specifically requirements and feedback provided in the agency comment letter under EPA letterhead to the Deep Bedrock Investigation final report. The Coakley Group is proceeding with the well completions work plan to evaluate hydraulics in a select number of wells that are really located and focused largely on the east side. That will inform further the scope of the effort to fully flush out that issue. Our understanding is, based on the data we have, that contaminant migration eastward is limited. If there is an eastward component at all, we have yet to really confirm that. Historically, as you may recall, before the landfill was capped, there was radial flow coming off the landfill, would have pushed contaminants to the east. And there is a marine clay layer in the subsurface that would be prone to absorbing those contaminants and then diffusing them out over time. So there's a number of factors there that have to be considered, but the first step is the hydraulics and analytical data from those wells that are in the completion component of the work plans that are on the table right now.
Just add to that, Drew, that one of the private wells that I mentioned earlier that has already been addressed and was identified as having been impacted by the landfill based on the presence of 1,4-dioxane in that private well, had not had high levels of 1,4-dioxane previously until the last couple of years. And so that well is on the east side of the landfill on Lafayette Road. It was connected to municipal water. But that well is being converted into a permanent monitoring well to assess, if that contamination is still existing in that area after the pumping stress is removed. The water supply well has been removed. There's no pumping stress, and so we can assess now if the contamination is still present there, or if it's moving or is being impacted by that well. And that's part of the work on the east side of the landfill.
All right. Go ahead, Representative Muns.
Thank you. And I don't mean to monopolize all of your time, but I do have several questions. So trying to understand the timeline going forward. So the new standards, the new drinking water standards were published last Friday. They go into effect in June. You mentioned that there are going to be that the screening levels are going to be recalculated for Coakley in May. So what happens then? I mean, and what is the, and I know everything is, it's difficult to pin everything down, but what is the time frame? What can we expect to see over the next 3, 6, 12 months in terms of getting closer to a final determination as to whether there needs to be some form of significant remediation? And maybe the other question is that even, is that just a remote dream that we can have some final answer?
Let's take a first stab, at least on part of that. We have, it's the screening levels, the data that we need for the screening levels will be finalized in May. And then we just need kind of the final, what those final numbers are in order to recalculate the site-specific levels. But all indications are that our site-specific levels will drop perhaps significantly. And that impacts how we're looking at surface water and fish consumption. And in the short term, once we have those values, we'll be able to reassess what the potential risk is from surface water and fish consumption, and take action as necessary there.
Do we have all the, excuse me, do we have all the data we need to be able to do that analysis, or is there going to have to be additional sampling done that will end up taking some time frame? Well,
the good news, if you want to call it that, at Coakley is that, we've been pretty proactive with respect to emerging contaminants in New England in general, and especially at Coakley. And so we have a pretty robust data set. in surface water, in bedrock, certainly in groundwater. I mentioned I think there's 14 or 15 or maybe even 16 data points now from private wells that have been sampled since 2017. So we have a pretty robust data set, and we have a good sense of the extent of contamination. Although, as Drew mentioned, we have ongoing work to kind of bolster that and fill data gaps associated with what's getting into the surface water. We know what's in the surface water, where we need to better assess how much it's coming from the groundwater and how much is coming from the landfill cap, evaluating the east side of the landfill, and then monitoring these flow paths in groundwater that were identified from the bedrock investigation. So we have a lot of data, and we can compare that against our new screening levels and against other applicable standards. So,
and again, I apologize, but I'm not a scientist. So we have the new standards. We compare the data that we have. We have to fill in some gaps in the data, and we do that. So we have our complete data set. We lay that against the new standards that have been set, and we either find out that everything's good, we're good, we're below the standards, or there's some problems and we're above the standards. When would we be in a position to be able to know whether we've passed, when will we be in a position to go past that pass-fail point? Because that then I would assume drives what we do next in terms of remediation. So are we looking at being in a position in this summer to have a sense as to, okay, we got a problem. We've got a problem with PFAS or some other contaminant, in the surface water under the new standards. So now we've got to figure out what to do about that.
Mm-hmm.
What's that time frame?
We have to be clear, we will be recalculating the screening levels that we can use to screen for what the potential risk is. Those aren't standards, as I mentioned. Those aren't enforceable standards like the MCLs, and the MCLs don't apply directly to a Superfund site either. We will be, once we recalculate those screening levels, which is happening this month, we'll be able to determine pretty quickly what the next steps would need to be, at least from a management standpoint, as far as adopting new contaminants of concern at the site and moving forward with evaluating what remedial alternatives may be required.
Please, again, bear with me. I'm not trying to be difficult, but so when will we be in a position where we can begin to identify what the remediation alternatives might be?
Again, we'll recalculate the screening levels. We'll compare those against the data that we have, determine the extent of any unacceptable risks that there may be, and then take action to determine what our next step would be, whether it's a remedial action or what that might be. That part, we can't put a timeline on that.
And I would add to that, Skip and Chris, that the components that Skip, you mentioned in terms of additional data collection for surface water groundwater interaction, combined with the revised screening levels, will certainly feed into our decision process but acknowledging also that the Coakley Landfill Group has intention anyway, it appears, to proceed with applying for this through this loan program, which is 100% principal relief, to explore technologies and application of those technologies at the site to remove PFAS from surface water or stormwater. And that is a technology that could maybe best be applied on the landfill cap runoff itself. I don't know really where that will land, but that is a unique situation where all that stormwater that's landing on the cap could be captured through existing drainage systems, and that application process is going to take about a year to move through, because there's a pre-application and then there's a selection that our water division at DES will make and advance that to the next phase if this project is selected. To my understanding, that there's not a lot of interest, or a lot of demand, maybe is the better word, for this particular approach, because it's specific to landfill leachate or landfill related PFAS runoff or leachate. So that may increase the odds of that moving forward. But combined with the data collection for the data gap analysis, surface water, groundwater interaction, these two might dovetail quite well, in terms of exploring what might be able to be applied technology-wise at the site over the next year.
You were going exactly in the direction that I was heading as well, and I guess what I'm struggling with is, how can the Coakley Landfill Group or anyone submit an application for something if we don't know, A, whether we have a real problem, or B, what the alternatives to addressing that problem are? I mean, how do you apply for something if you don't even know that there's a problem? So that's why I'm trying to understand what that time frame is.
Sure. And I think, determining the problem in terms of the site and risk is one thing. Determining whether there's a problem in terms of recognizing that there's PFAS in the stormwater, surface water running off the landfill cap is another thing. So we know that. We know that is a problem, so to speak. That we recognize that the landfill cap is contributing to the PFAS loading of the Barry's Brook watershed, and that in and of itself is sufficient to move forward. The application is just conceptual on the first round, as long as it meets the intent of a municipality or group of municipalities attempting to reduce PFAS from a waste stream, and that is what this would be aligned with. So
when does that application process open?
The solicitation for those initial proposals went out at the beginning of the month, and that first round of solicitation closes at the end of May, I believe. So, and it's my understanding that the Coakley Landfill Group is considering that. There's no, it's not certain that they're going to pursue that, but we've had conversations with the group that is supporting this program, and there appears to be intent to pursue. And then after that, there would be an evaluation period by the program staff, and there would be a request for proposals by the end of August, I believe, and they would be provided a number of months to prepare those proposals and resubmit, and then the selections would be done approximately a year from now.
How much money is available?
I'm not probably the one to speak to that. It's my understanding that it's on the order of $2 to $2.5 million per year, but last year was the first year of the program, and they had very little interest. So there's some overflow from that, if you will, that was not expended. So there's it's multi-million.
Okay.
But
Okay,
it could be, cover a lot of different projects. So it's not just this one, of course,
Okay.
depending on how many projects may be submitted for proposal.
Well, I'll let somebody else ask a question.
Representative Malloy, would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, thanks. Chris, from your conversation here tonight, I know you're a results-oriented guy, and you're going down the right road here for some direct answers to what the process is. But Chris, this is specifically directed at you right now. What does remediate? You've used the term remediation 3 or 4 or 5 times here. What does that look like to you? I mean, what is satisfactory remediation with not knowing all the things that we yet need to know? And to the rest of the group, then how much will that cost? See, we have a lot of unknowns here. That's my point I'm trying to make here. That's all. That's my comment.
Well, I think my definition of remediation would be that, if we know that if we know that there are contaminants in the water above the allowed limits, we are doing whatever we have to, or we're doing what we have to eliminate those contaminants from the water, ideally at the source. So that downstream, and then water that's taken from the ground in wells, that residents and businesses in the area of the landfill can be assured that their water is safe for human consumption, human use.
Well, thanks. That's good.
But that's just me.
Yeah, I understand. But it seems knowing. I mean, I was on the Seacoast Cancer Cluster Commission. We filed a report, and we did a lot of work on this stuff. And Richard's seen my face, and Drew's seen my face, and others have seen my face. I've been to all these meetings, and it seems from where I sit, I don't think there's enough money on the planet to remediate or clean this place up. It's huge. And so EPA, what do you do about that? Because that's EPA's response. As I understand it, it's a Superfund site. So this really lies with the EPA. Is that correct or not?
EPA is the lead overseer for the cleanup. It's the responsibility of the responsible parties, including the Coakley Landfill Group, to manage that cleanup, implement it, and pay for it. And like we do at all sites, and all the time, we're continuously assessing risk at Superfund sites, whether it's from changing conditions or new contaminants or new information about the toxicity of a contaminant. We go back and continuously assess the extent of the risk at the site and make changes as necessary. If those changes require additional remediation or modified remediation, the government would have to pay for it if there's no responsible party, but ultimately it would go to the responsible party where there is one. So they're bound by the CD to do this, technically to do these same evaluations and to make changes as required to address risk.
So to be clear, the Coakley Landfill Group then is the overarching organization that would take care of, to use Chris's term, remediation, but the members of the Coakley Landfill Group are going to pay for it, like Portsmouth and Newington and the people that dumped in there and all the people that brought the hauling firms that brought stuff in there and all that. Is that who pays for it then?
That's how it's set up right now in the current consent decree, where those costs would be their responsibility for implementing the remedy and any modifications to the remedy moving forward.
Okay, just to be clear, I wanted to get that out there again. Yeah, thank you.
And then to also be clear that it's EPA that actually selects that remedy, but the PRPs or the responsible party are the ones that implement the remedy and pay for it. So it's EPA's responsibility to actually, select that remedy, whatever it may be. Maybe multiple different things. It may be phased approach. We may do a number of different things, depending on the risk associated with different media. But we're the ones that select the remedy.
All right, there are no other questions in the chat right now and no other hands raised. Oh, Mindy, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Great, thank you. I'm glad you just said that, Melissa, because I was getting a little concerned about the way some of the questions were going. I guess, so I have two questions. One, the first one doesn't have to deal with that, but it's a follow-on to that. The first one is, now we know at least 15 wells are contaminated with PFAS above the standard. We know those people have been drinking the water for a while. We also know that historically there has been lots of concern, especially I'm thinking in the southern side where people before they were connected to public water had concerns about health issues. So I'm wondering, along with these new standards, what plans are in place to do a health assessment of the conditions around the people who live around the landfill and who have. Because, all we have had is, I think it was a 1991 era health assessment done. And then, this double cancer cluster evaluation that happened a few years ago, but there hasn't been any update in a long time. And we now know that there's a lot of additional exposure and possible health effects from the people experienced by the people who live around the landfill. And then I'll ask my second question. That might be a question for Melissa, I'm not sure.
Well, it really is the state health department is the one that does the health assessments. So we'd have to have a conversation with them as to whether or not they would be willing to do that health assessment. So, we can do that. We can work with Drew and people at DES to, discuss whether or not that makes sense and that they're willing to do that. But EPA doesn't do the health assessments. It's really the State Department of Public Health that does that.
So is there a formal request needed to have that, evaluated by someone?
Well, I mean, if you've mentioned it, we can certainly talk with, DES about that and bring in DPH and see if that, something like that makes sense and, see if they're willing to do that.
We have environmental health program risk assessor Jonathan Patali and Administrator Karen Craver on the line. So, John, you had your hand raised.
Yeah, and it might be me and Karen jostling for the same sort of tag thing. So those public health assessments, historically, they were done by our Department of Health when they had our ATSDR program, but that now sits over at DES because DPHS no longer does those. So that's something that usually for those kinds of requests, we can work with ATSDR on trying to see if it's feasible to do that kind of public health assessment at a site. So that's something that I know we brought up several times of if there's questions, you can reach out and contact us. Just usually no one ever contacts us. As far as like the cancer cluster goes, I know Karen can speak more to that because that was a distinct different thing from ATSDR, EPA, or any of those other agencies.
Yeah, and for the cancer cluster investigation, I'm going to be careful here to speak in my current role, not in my former role with the cancer program at DHHS. But I'm still involved as a member of the Cancer Concern Review Team at the Department of Health and Human Services and do step in to assist when concerns come in. So what I'll do is place a link in the chat to the summary report for the Pediatric Seacoast Cancer Cluster investigation and the summary of findings and just a high level overview, there was not a common source of exposure found, and the cases weren't clustered around any one specific geographic area. But I'll put that link in so that folks can read that on their own. And then I would defer questions to Whitney Hammond at Department of Health and Human Services, and I can include her email as well.
And Karen and John, in regard to Mindy's question, certainly the MCLs are going to have, far-reaching implications across the state, and I don't know the full extent of public water systems that were delivering water above the MCL, but below the current the current state MCL or AGQS. But I think the concern could be extended far beyond just the area around Coakley. I do know that the Rye Water District has impacted wells and with PFAS that probably are, I believe, are above the EPA MCLs.
Yeah, and again, that's where, even for over in the Merrimack area, the ATSDR, so the branch of the CDC that deals with doing these public health assessments, they are working on a private well assessment that should be finalized whenever it gets through its review process. That should be coming out soon. But they are also working on one for the public water system consumers. And a lot of that would be very relatable to anything that we're seeing in other communities at various levels. So it is possible to make a request to do a specific community level assessment for a very individual area, but there's also going to be things that are coming out that are probably very broad and applicable to other communities. So again, we can follow up on that. If that's something the commission wants to learn more about how that process works, we can bring the whole Apple Tree team, do coffee, and talk it through sometime.
Okay, so you don't need a formal request, or you do?
So,
There's no,
I mean,
sorry, go ahead, John. I was just going to say there's not a there's not a formal request. I mean, you can just reach out to us to make that request, and then we would meet with you and talk about it. It's called petitioning when you make a request of the Apple Tree the team, but there's not a formal form.
Okay. My second question has to do with the status that Representative Muns was talking about. And I'm glad that Alan Brooks is here, because I would like to hear now about, HB 494 went into effect. It was supposed to be implemented by 2020. Now the MCLs are in place or about to be in place. I'm hearing the stuff about, applying for 2 years it's going to take to get this money from the state. That is really, to me, is, however they want to pay for it's fine, but that doesn't remove the requirement to comply with state law and with, now the federal law. So I would like to know how, last time we spoke with Mr. Brooks, this, we thought this EPA would eventually, these EPA MCLs would go into effect eventually, but they hadn't yet. And so I'd like to hear how that might, speed up the schedule for dealing with the surface water issue from this site. The fact that the law was already passed and the deadlines have passed, and now EPA agrees there's an issue, or I'm sure it will, as at the end of May or June. So if you could update us on that, that would be helpful.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And I don't think that materially things have changed from the last meeting that we had, the smaller meeting that we had recently, in the sense that the law says that we have to act consistently with the consent decree, and we always have to act consistently with federal law. So EPA is still the driver, but I think what you're hearing today is obviously a lot has changed on the federal side since last time. And I know we went over it rather quickly, and I appreciate that it was done efficiently, but I want people to understand just how big of changes have occurred at the federal level since last time. So I'm sure there'll be a lot of things for everyone to look into. And if for some reason, if EPA imposes an additional remedy and the landfill group does not implement that remedy, then certainly we stand with EPA, and I think we're all ready to enforce what that is.
So my concern is about this, what seems to be sort of a lengthened unfolding schedule kind of happening, where, this has been something we've been asking for. The legislature passed the law years ago. So I want to have I guess I want to hear an update about, and this is kind of what Representative Muns was talking about, you know, what is the schedule we think? I don't think it's appropriate, in my opinion, to wait until they get money from this 2-year-long process of whatever it is to get the money from the state, especially when the deadlines for the state law have passed. So I just wanted to hear sort of what that timeline would look like.
And are you asking me what that timeline would look like, or what EPA
Yes,
thinks?
I'd like to hear it.
Yeah, and I go back to the discussion that we had, which is our time frame for the attorney, me or anyone else at the Attorney General's office, would depend on the remedy selection from EPA and what CLG is actually required to do. So we wouldn't be out in front of a remedy. We wouldn't ask for something we wouldn't even know what to ask for. So we do have to wait for EPA in consultation with DES to figure out what additional work needs to be done. It is very technical. It does perhaps take a long time, but I think things are actually moving at that level.
So Skip and Drew, can you give us a timeline? I know you're hesitant too. So are we talking years? Are we talking 1 year? Are we talking 5 years? Do you have sort of a framework in mind for this? I'm talking about addressing the surface water issues.
So you know, I'll take a first stab at that. You know, is conveyed tonight. You know, the EPA is beginning the process of reevaluating and incorporating revised risk numbers or revised toxicity information, and to update the site-specific screening levels. So that will come into play, and that will facilitate an assessment of risk, and whether if there's an unacceptable risk, and we have risk assessors on board too to speak to that. But if an unacceptable risk is identified and a remedy is needed to address that, then the state would support you know, EPA on that decision, and we'd move forward. Timing wise, you know, I think we've provided what we can in terms of what we see in the near future as far as updating those standards. And Skip, I would hand it off to you for further consideration there.
Yeah, you know, as far as the timeline goes, I can't really give you anything more than what I responded before. I mean, we will be getting the definitive information that we need in the form of the toxicity values that will be used for the RSLs, and then we can make that calculation for the site-specific levels that we use at Coakley. To clarify, the MCLs, you know, are not currently applicable to the Coakley landfill in any way. They could be adopted as a contaminant of concern at some point, and then that would be as a cleanup level for groundwater. There's no standards for surface water. So what we have is our screening level, but with that we can assess the extent of contamination that is above the screening level, as we've been doing all along. And I don't want to minimize the problem in surface water as it's been characterized. It certainly is a problem, the levels of contaminants in surface water. But the screening level is based on, as a lot of people know, it's based on a scenario where someone is recreating in the in surface water and ingesting an amount of water over a period of 45 or 120 days a year. So that's, you know, that's kind of what we have to work with. And as far as the timeline goes, once we have those definitive values from the update to this regional screening levels that EPA puts out, we can move quickly to recalculate our screening levels, compare against the data that we have, and then we can, and in all likelihood, from everything I understand, those numbers are going to go down, meaning that the area of surface water that is exceeding those screening levels will increase from what as we currently understand it. We can then risk assessors will do a risk evaluation. It's not a risk assessment, but that's evaluating under those, again, those circumstances that we assume for surface water, what the risk may be to a recreator using surface water, if it's an unacceptable added risk. And that can happen in fairly short order after we recalculate the site-specific screening levels. And then we'd be able to tell, now we have, more authority to take some action based on that.
Okay, thanks.
And just to add to that, like once we determine that there's, if we determine that there's an unacceptable risk, that would create a basis for action. Then we'd have to look at, okay, well, we have to evaluate the alternatives. What makes sense to actually, take care of this issue? Do we take care of the surface water first? Do we take care of, private wells first? Do we take care of something else first? All of those things have to play into, how we would, evaluate the overall site and make sense and determine like, okay, what actions need to happen. So, it's not, unfortunately, it's not a simple answer in terms of timing because there's a lot of factors that play into that. Hopefully, I think determining whether or not there's an unacceptable risk or not, that can probably be done in the short term, but determining, whether or not there's, a basis for action, remedial alternatives, what actions are taken, do we phase it out or, do we put it all into one decision document? Those things will take a little bit more time.
All right, I'm going to go to Representative Malloy, and then we do have a question in the chat after that.
Thank you. Thank you, Melissa, for mentioning private wells. I'm particularly interested in that, and Drew knows this. Drew is in, and Amy Hudner from DES was in Greenland last November to do our test, our private well test. We're also on a commission for the Seacoast Long-Term Drinking Water Commission, and we are doing well testing for those who want it. I think we have about 160 people take part of that. They're from Greenland and Rye, and I think Newington might have been in there. Those had private wells. So my question to you, Drew, or to anybody, is did any of that information that we collected from those residents have any relevancy to this? Is there any usable data from those tests? Those are thorough tests. The DES provided the leadership for that. These were not tests that you got a kit and you took it off to some lab that we didn't know about. You organized that, DES did. The question, is there any relevant information we gathered from that to apply to any of this regarding Coakley and the area?
Thank you for the question, Dennis, and it's a good one. And I know I remember having this conversation last November with you and Amy and others, and I admit that I have not followed up to inquire of that data set, as that may would be interesting to see it in a spatial sense what the results are. Right. I can say though that we're pretty confident that we understand the fate and transport of contaminants migrating from Coakley. And so we have a pretty good monitoring network, both monitoring wells and private wells that are in the monitoring program, that we have a good handle on that. So this would be a broader picture than that. And we don't see, we have low levels of PFAS in a lot of wells. Not only around Coakley, but statewide. Teasing out the links there is the challenge. But I think I appreciate the comment, and it's something that I will follow up with Amy Hudnor on and see if we can get a hold of that data and share that with you.
All right, I'll go to the question in the chat now. So this question is from Senator Altschiller, and it's a two-part question. So what is the notification mechanism for new builds? There is a new neighborhood behind the Bethany Church. Is that a runoff zone?
I'll take that one. So I believe the neighborhood behind Bethany Church that you speak of is off Route 1, Lafayette Road, and that is whether it be apartment complex or condos. It did come across my desk through development for larger developments. Normally, individual housing developments wouldn't. That property is not within the groundwater management zone, so it wouldn't normally be triggered as a notification process to us. But because of the size of it, and it did come across my desk, and I shared it with EPA as well. It's on I believe that's in, I think it's in Rye, right? So it is on the Rye Water District. It's not utilizing any of any groundwater. It is just, it does have stormwater collection basins. We reviewed that in light of its location to the GMZ, and we didn't see any issue with it. So yes, we are notified on certain things, and we're certainly keeping an eye out beyond that for developments outside of the GMZ. But in terms of notifying the state of developments, if it's just a house being proposed, say off Breakfast Hill Road, and it's not within the GMZ, we wouldn't necessarily be notified. We don't have a mechanism in place to do that.
Right. The senator is asking if you could put the map back up for a moment.
Sure.
Right. So when you say it came across your desk, do you get that from towns or developers?
That came in from other programs at DES. I think it was the alteration of terrain group that provided that.
Right. I don't see the map if you think you're sharing.
Oh.
I'm seeing it.
You're seeing it? Okay.
Yeah, this map here, the one that I shared in the presentation. Is that coming through, Amy?
It is, yes. Yep.
Okay.
Okay. I don't see any other questions from the senator. So everyone put their hands down. Representative Muns.
So I hope Dr. LaPresto is still on the call, because I saw that she had a question, and hopefully we'll ask it. But I can't remember who discussed this. I think it was you, Skip. Surface water. I know that has been an issue, and you alluded to that. Can you maybe just explain that a little bit further? I mean, what the challenges are with surface water and regulation of surface water? You had mentioned that, you had mentioned that there are no standards for surface water, and then earlier you'd said that, some of the PFAS standards for drinking water could be used for surface water, but only if it supports drinking sources, I think. Maybe just talk a little bit about that, because that has been a source of concern from people about, what's in the water that people see standing on the surface.
So the MCLs from the Safe Drinking Water Act program are applicable to water supplies. The Superfund program, when a site is designated for a cleanup in a remedy is selected, there's certain rules and laws, state and federal, that may apply to that cleanup. So if we're cleaning up groundwater at a site, we may have to comply with state and federal groundwater standards, drinking water standards, if that groundwater is going to be used for drinking or can be in the future. So that was what I was referring to when the MCLs become official. Superfund sites can adopt those as a cleanup standard for groundwater. The toxicity information that's used to develop those MCLs, I understand, is what we'll be using now for calculating our screening levels for surface water. There's no, again, I'm not familiar with any state standards. There's no federal standards for PFAS in surface water. So, we can't say you're exceeding this number that's a standard for aquatic life. You need to do something. That's not in place, but we do have our screening levels that we can compare the data against and assess, the extent of risk.
Well, and we can also use those screening levels to, the toxicity values that are used to create the screening levels, those can also be used to determine risk. So that's what we would use instead of, in lieu of not having standards, we take a risk-based approach to determine, what the level of risk is from ingestion of surface water.
And this is another example of where I may be showing my ignorance, so bear with me. And I'm not even suggesting that this is something that the state might necessarily want to do, but since there are no standards in place for surface water contamination, if the state wanted to pass some standards, would those apply to a Superfund site?
Potentially. We would do an evaluation once those standards came out. We would do an evaluation to determine if we thought they were what we call ARARs, the applicable and relevant or appropriate standards. So we would do that evaluation if we said that they were, if those actually standards were ARARs and we had a risk from the surface water, then we could apply those. Yeah. But Cindy, tell me if I'm off base on that, but that's how it works.
But essentially what I'm hearing you say, and I don't mean to be too flippant when I say this, is that, the state could pass something, but if you decided it wasn't relevant, or you could ignore it.
Well, I don't know
It's
about
probably
ignoring it, but we would have to evaluate whether or not we would consider it an ARAR. We would look at a number of different. Yeah. We would look at how it was calculated, the application of it. There's a number of things that we would do to determine whether or not it was an adoptable standard. So it's not a absolute, but I mean on the whole, we typically will adopt state standards when we do a new remedy.
Right, I was going to say
we
that.
only
It
we
would
only
be for a new
adopt
remedy,
like state
not-
standards.
right.
Yeah, go ahead, Cindy.
I was just going to say the record of decision for the existing remedy is the ARARs are frozen at the time that is selected. But here we're going to be looking at and deciding whether or not additional work is needed. And at that time, if there's we reassess all of the what Melissa referred to as ARARs, all of the laws that might apply, and determine how that would apply to the new selected remedy, the amendment to the remedy, just like we would for anything. We do that for all remedy selection. So if there's a change that's needed, we would absolutely go back and look at all the ARRs.
I think go ahead, sorry.
No, I just to further clarify, like in order for an existing remedy to adopt new standards, we have to show that there's an unacceptable risk first in order to then choose a new remedy and adopt those standards.
I think the one person on this call charged with keeping people like me out of trouble wanted to say something. Alan?
Well, thank you. And it was partly a refinement of the question, and I think, though, that it's been answered, which is there's a difference between new sites and sites that already have a record of decision, and it's fairly significant. So I just want everyone to understand that for the most part, state rules that have general applicability are, for the most of the time, will be addressed in a new site and a new remedy. But by virtue of the fact that they're state rules. But when you have an existing site like this, EPA can look at it, but they're really looking at their decision as to whether there's an indication that there is a health risk there that needs to be addressed. And the standard for doing that, I think, is actually even different from a new site to a site that exists. I think it's a 1 in 100,000 risk versus 1 in a million risk. EPA can talk more about that. But the general, I think, takeaway is that for a state's rule to have meaning, it's a lot easier in a new site than it is in a site like Coakley that's been going on for a while.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Jonathan, did you want to add something to this discussion before I go to Dr. Lepresto's question?
Yeah, because I have a feeling it might come back up as kind of related to an example. So, for example, in New Hampshire, we are looking at applying the MCL as a surface water standard, but that's only going to be for water bodies that are 20 miles upstream of a public water system intake. So that, if you go through and look at the ARRs, that's probably not going to match this water body whatsoever, because this is not being used by a public water system. We did produce a plan in late 2019 going to 2020, a plan, budget, and timeline explaining to the legislature what it would take for the state to create those surface water standards. That's because the legislature directed us just to do that, develop a plan, budget, and timeline. They did not authorize us to create those standards. So we did put that plan forward. I know I've personally gone with DES staff to multiple commissions and presented that. It's gone nowhere, but that is one of the things that information is out there. So that is something that we have put forward and explained before, some of the challenges of the state trying to develop its own standards independent of the EPA for surface water criteria.
What you said those standards would not apply here, but what about the fact that there are, Aquarian has a number of wells that are certainly within 20 miles of the site.
So is Aquarian pulling from like Barry's Brook or the stream there? That's the question for surface water.
They're not pulling directly from Barry's Brook, but Barry's Brook.
Then it would not apply.
Okay, that's what I was trying to get at.
Yeah, groundwater and surface water. So is the intake taking in water from a surface water system, or is it taking it from a groundwater well? Yes, okay. There is a large connection, but that's the break there.
Okay, that's what I want. That's what I wanted to understand. Thank you.
Yeah.
But I would add, if it's fair to say, John, that the MCLs do apply directly to that well. If it's a public water supply well, although they may take that well water and blend it with other sources, but and to achieve their regulatory thresholds. But the MCL would apply directly to those types of situations.
All right, Dr. Lepresto, thank you for being patient. You could ask your question.
Thank you very much. Well, first off, I do want to say that I do believe that there should be a study performed looking at the incidence of cancer in the Seacoast area in the adult and pediatric population. This has nothing to do with the Seacoast cancer cluster. I did read that report, and there were some data gaps in that report. But since that report was completed, there has been a significant number of cases in this area, just non-genetic, and that really is the difference. These particular pediatric cases are not genetic, and they are cancers that are from endocrine gland disruptors. Endocrine glands, and we know that PFAS is an endocrine gland disruptor. For example, thyroid cancer, renal cell carcinoma, brain cancer. So we really do need to look into that and do an incidence over, this has been going on, for decades. And I'm not sure, correct me if I'm wrong, if there was ever a true study performed looking at the incidence in the adult and pediatric population, along with the other chronic diseases like, that it causes, like hyperlipidemia. And then, of course, all the developmental delays. As we know, there is a high rate of that in this area as well. The other thing I want to touch upon is at several RYE Select Board meetings in the past, New Hampshire DES and Skip Hull have presented updates to the select boards. And the update is the remedy is natural attenuation, and monitoring is the remedy. And that truly has, that is in all the records of decision and so forth. Is that really sufficient anymore? In light of what we know, and the other issue is with the surface water. Surface water does migrate to groundwater. Do we know the extent of the contaminants getting into the groundwater? I do know, because I am now one of the water commissioners, that are, all of our wells have these legacy PFAS, PFOA and PFOS. Aquarium wells have the same. Now, and then, Dr. Patali was talking about the ENV WQ 1703 or 1700. I don't know, I may have missed completely the explanation as far as the 20 miles upstream. But, Little River does supply groundwater, and the aquarium wells do draw off of the tributary to the Little River. And that was shown years ago by, a geological report by Tom Mack, who happens to live in Rye. So I'm not sure what that means. If, I don't know, maybe Dr. Patali can explain that again, as far as, that we don't have any public, I'm looking at this, that we don't have any public water intakes. Well, we have Little River, and then Bailey Brook. There's a lot of questions that haven't been answered from this report. Like you state in the report that Bailey Brook is a sub-watershed of Barry Brook. So if that's the case, then I don't see how that could apply. As you know, a sub-watershed nests within another watershed. So if that is true, as you state in the report, then Bailey Brook, the groundwater would be affected. Anyway, just some comments. Thank you.
I'm not sure where it was there. You had quite a slurry of comments and questions. Thank you for those, Dr. Lopresto. In regards to the drinking water intakes, there aren't any direct drinking water intakes from surface waters in proximity of any of the surface water features near the stemming from this area, Little River, Barry's Brook. And so, but as we discussed, the MCLs, EPA's new MCLs will be applicable at those wellheads because they're public water supplies. That may not, like we discussed, it may be a combination, a combining of water supplies. So the water district may have options to essentially dilute a higher concentration well, such as the case may be in Rye. But in general, the MCLs apply directly, so it's kind of covered in that respect. In regards to your sub-watershed question, I was going to pull up a figure that I thought I had open. I believe I'm sharing my screen still. If that can be seen, this is showing, it is showing watersheds. The yellow line here is indicating watershed boundaries. This is the Norton Brook side, and this is the Berries Brook side. This is this dotted line down here illustrates the Little River watershed. So as you were, this green line is Berries Brook. The dark green line is Bailey Brook. So Bailey Brook is a sub-watershed within Berries Brook, but it is its own watershed. I did have a conversation with our watershed bureau in our water division, gentleman there. So it could be separated out as its own watershed, but that would create so many watersheds that it would be more difficult to manage them statewide. But in terms of Bailey's Brook, in terms, we have, there have been samples collected from Bailey's Brook. We don't have hydraulic data that support significant migration. We're not even certain there's any migration to the east. That is going to be flushed out more in the eastern landfill area work plan that we spoke of earlier. But combined with the groundwater data, hydraulic data, and the surface water data that's been collected from Bailey Brook, we do not see an impact. We certainly see, if I were to give percentages, 90+% of impacts we see are northwest of the landfill in the Berries Brook watershed, directly in affecting Berries Brook itself. And then the other 10%, maybe, or less than 10%, would be possibly in the Little River direction. So if you have follow on, I'm happy to address additional questions.
Well, let's go over that data, because a lot of my questions were on that data, the surface water sampling data that you have. And you saw my comments, because a lot of that data, as you know, was from 2016 and 2017. And then when you look deeper into the data, there's questioning on the methodology. Well, now the EPA method has changed, right? Now they're using EPA method 1633 and not 537M. But really the key of that data is the sampling methodology. So for example, on the Berry Brook surface water sampling technique, December 2016, Stephen Roy and yourself, the comment in the table is that it's a surface water sample collection. But when you then go further into the collections, it wasn't surface water at all, because you removed, in several, because they were also done in December, you removed inches and inches of ice. And that, that's really where all the PFAS was. And then if you go into, the Conservation Law Foundation, and then the Musselman engineer group, they really don't have, they're not specific in how they took their samples. So we don't even know if you can utilize that data. We don't even know if it was surface water. And as you know, as you can from the ITRC data, that the surface water, sampling the wastewater is integral to getting accurate data. I mean, I don't, and then, you know, I guess what I'm talking about and where I'm going is the foam that I personally have observed in Berry Brook at the CV acre conservation land, which actually is you could really call that as lower Berry's Brook, where there's been no samples taken that far out. And I don't know why. I mean, I'm just wondering if we can do that and if you would be willing to do that on and state that you'd be willing to sample that far out on this call today. We do know from all the data in Michigan and Wisconsin and Minnesota, all the information on ITRC about PFAS in foam, that we really are behind the curve. There has been foam witnessed even at Pease Tradeport that no one's even looked at yet, except for you know, the chair of the RAB committee, who did her own took her own sample. So anyway, so my question is about, is the sampling methodology that's been used reliable? After what you know, all the comments that I made, the comment, one of the samples, let's see, I think it's number 4 from the Conservation Law Foundation. Let me just get to that. Well, when I contacted Tom Irwin, Attorney Irwin, he couldn't even find that in his data. So we would like, I'm not sure if that's the one, but anyway, I put it in my comment area. So can you comment, Drew, on any of that stuff, the methodology that was used? Can we still utilize that data in light of all the new changes?
And John, I see you turned your camera on. You're welcome to speak to this as well. You know, point taken. You know, I think, you know, it's worth a review of the sampling methodology for surface water in light of the references you provide, the ITRC guidance. And particularly, as Skip mentioned, we're going to be updating site-specific screening levels for surface water. So we'll want to be sure to be collecting data that's representative. So I believe we feel confident in the data we have to date, and it represents a decreasing concentration the further you get away from the site, and that's repeated data collection. And I'm sharing the screen here showing surface water collection points along Berry's Brook. So, and I speak particularly about this location down here at Lafayette Road crossing in Berry's Brook. So, you know, they collect biannual samples from that location, and we've seen consistent results. And that gives us confidence that at that location where you know, the concentrations are below the site-specific screening levels that currently exist for the site, and therefore doesn't warrant collection of additional surface water data further downstream. But John, did you maybe have a comment on that and or the foam question?
Yeah, so it's related to the foam issue. Our group of
Can't hear you,
studies that we're
Jonathan.
trying to go on. Oh, nice. Can you hear me?
Yeah, kind of. It's
very
a little
muted.
bit in and out.
Not mute, but
Sorry, can you hear me better now if I pull the computer closer to my face? There we go. Okay, so I had to be closer or screaming. So one, there are actually a group of folks from Dartmouth that have been trying to do foam and air-water interface sampling in the Great Bay Area and some of the fresh water bodies around the state. So I just wanted to point out that there are other people working in the state that are related to that. There is a fundamental challenge of even trying to ask a responsible party right now, or the EPA or anyone, to sample for foam. There's no standardized methods for that. And I know that from talking with the folks in Minnesota and Michigan, because they're all part of the Foamy Friends group that's in the ITRC, and I helped to write that document as well. So some of New Hampshire people are co-authors on that document. So we are keenly aware of the ITRC document. But there are no standardized methods for that. That's something they're trying to validate. We're trying some of those methods out here, but we also have different water conditions. We also have different contamination conditions. In Michigan, they're sampling foam at a AFFF impacted marsh that doesn't allow the PFAS to drain out or dilute. And they're also looking at some lake conditions where it is higher amounts than what we see even in the surface waters around here that's whipping up. So there are some differences in that, and trying to understand what the best method to use is something we're still working out. But until there's a consistent method to get consistent results, we could go out tomorrow and measure it, but the same points you're bringing up, that things changed in 2016, right? The methods changed, so we're questioning that now. We'd be running into a similar situation if we run out and do it right now without a validated method. The other challenge is there are some labs that can analyze it, but there's also some labs that are really shy about measuring foam samples because of all the various organic matter that's in there that can either give them false positives, or if the PFAS high concentrations are high enough, it just blows out their instrument for the week. So it's something that folks are looking into, but there isn't a consistent method yet. So that's probably still ways out from being able to actually sample foams and tease them apart like that.
If we're ready to move on, Mindy, do you have a question?
I have a follow-on to what Dr. LaPresto was talking about. Drew, if you go back to the prior slide that you showed, and I see that Jim Sukop is on too, and I know that Skip is familiar with this as well. But if you just do the old-fashioned fracture trace analysis, you can see the angularity of those brooks really tells you that those brooks are fracture controlled, at least along the prominent and then the other directions. So when you look at the flow, I mean, certainly up in close to the Coakley landfill, when there's a storm, I'm sure, and whatever happens up there, there's going to be higher levels at the surface water there. But doing a full comprehensive analysis of what's going on at lower topographies along those brooks would be necessary to fully understand what kind of transport's going on and whether or not those wells are connected downstream to those fracture flow conditions or receiving some discharge or recharge along those brooks is important to understand. So, and that I know that's never been done. And I know that I see the samples you guys have taken and they're sort of up and close, and that doesn't necessarily conform to a homogeneous flow regime. It's going to be fracture controlled, and so it's going to pop up in places that along those brooks that isn't necessarily conforming to a homogeneous flow condition. So that's been my concern all along the way, and I agree with Dr. LaPresto about some of the comments she made, especially where you can see that those brooks are really fracture flow controlled. So I would ask sorry. So my comment is, I really would like to see a more comprehensive evaluation before we go saying things like those fractures aren't connected to some of these water supply wells, is my point.
So I see Jeff Martz, a hydrogeologist with NHDES, Hazardous Waste Remediation Bureau Administrator, is on. I look to you for your thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Mindy, for that question. And actually want to go back to something Representative Malloy brought up, and that was some of the regional sampling that's gone on in the Seacoast area. And I'm just going to share my screen just for a brief minute to show some of the extent of data that's been collected in the Seacoast area. And the green symbols on this map represent data points where the water quality for PFAS is below our current state MCLs or AGQS and MCLs for PFOA, PFOS, and the other two compounds that we regulate. And you can see that the Coakley landfill is located in the center where we have a number of monitoring wells that are shown in red, and those are instances where contaminants have been detected, specifically PFAS, over our previous standard of 70 parts per trillion. So what you can see is that there are a large number of water supply wells in the greater seacoast area. I'll zoom out a little more, that are in fact below our current state standards. So I think the value in some of these regional sampling efforts is that we get this big picture, and we don't see widespread contamination, at least above our current state standards in water supply wells.
Is that going to be reevaluated over the next, couple of months for the new standards then? I do see some surprising orange kind of along the brooks that I didn't know about.
Yeah,
so I assume they're,
Yeah, from a statewide perspective, we're certainly looking at these in the context of, EPA's proposed numbers. Our current viewers, and these data are all viewable from our public viewer. It looks a little different from the one I'm sharing on my screen. But everybody in the public can take a look at these data and pan around the state and see what we have for PFAS conditions in groundwater and surface water.
Right, and so that orange square, sort of up to the northwest of the town of Rye-Riding, that's on Barry's Brook. And then there's a couple of orange squares down, or those are circles, I think. I can't tell. Yeah, that one there.
This one here?
Yep.
Yeah, this looks like Barry's Brook. So that must be a surface water sample. It was, so we can see the date here. I don't see the date it was collected. Then you can drill down into the actual results table. We have individual compounds. So this particular sample was 12.5 for PFOA. So that's that result.
Yeah, thanks for showing that. Yeah, I'd be interested to see that after it's updated for the new standards too.
Yeah, just so I just changed my screen. This is the public facing one. So the same thing. Here's that same data point. You can click on it and it pulls up information. Some wells that have a time series data. Let's see if I can zoom in and find one. It'll actually generate a plot if we get public water systems over time. So our new viewer is quite powerful if you haven't had a chance to look at this. So this actually is, I believe this is one of the Rye public water wells. And you can see the various PFAS that we regulate and the multiple samples over time. So we do update our outward facing data fairly regularly.
I do want to note too that if you go onto the mapper on our website, it still looks like the mapper that Jeff was showing previously, and then that white box pops up. You do have to click on the link in that white box to get to this view. I know a lot of people are used to just passing by it, but that's how you get to this dashboard.
But to Representative Malloy's point, you can see there's a really high density of water samples in the seacoast area compared to moving further inland. There are some towns that just don't have the same density of sampling. So I always think there's value in having enhanced data from anywhere.
All right, if we're all set with that, Representative Muns, do you have a question or comment?
Yeah, I mean, I guess at the risk of, kind of beating a drum that's been beat quite a bit earlier, I'd like to kind of come back to, the timing and timeframes and what we can expect and maybe zero in on, what are some of the milestones that we should be looking for, paying attention to this summer, so that we can feel like progress is being made. I mean, the couple that I identified, and you tell me if I'm on the right path, is that, we heard that the EPA is going to recalculate the screening levels for Coakley, and that's going to happen in May. So, in my mind, by May 31st, we should be able to see those. There was also discussion about the window for applying for this special DES money for the special PFAS, I guess, runoff money. That window closes in May. So I guess, and I think we still have somebody from the CLG on the call with us. Does the CLG intend to apply for that? And if so, then that would be something that we would be looking to make sure gets done. So I don't know if there still is somebody from the CLG. Whether they want to comment on that.
We're here from the CLG. Thanks for the question, Representative Muns. Yeah, we talked with Drew and Skip earlier about this, and we've had a couple of calls with DES about it. I think it's very likely that we will apply for it. We have to put together an application. And as you said, it's a little bit complicated to know exactly what we're going to put in terms of a proposal for that work. But we think because it's a pre-application process, we think we can put one in that we can then tailor as we collect more data at the site. We're going further and pretty fast with the surface water, groundwater work, and we should be able to tailor some sort of pilot project that this grant. Well, it's the Clean Water State Revolving Loan Fund, but it has have a 100% forgiveness on the loan, so it's really like a grant. The other complication is that the CLG isn't it's its own entity to clean up the site, but it's not an entity that can apply for it. So the city of Portsmouth has to apply for it. So we have to get that authority to do that. But I think we can proceed at least with the pre-application and then figure out all the details as we go forward. But right now it looks very likely.
What's the deadline for that?
The end of May.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. And then in June, the final PFAS PFOA standards will be published. I mean, it's probably just a formality, but nevertheless something to look for. And then, if I heard correctly, if the CLG applies for that grant, they would hear whether they've gotten preliminary acceptance by August. Is that correct?
I believe that's what they told us on the phone, but I don't have that information in front of me.
Okay.
Now, what about sorry to interrupt. I just want to mention that I have with me City Attorney Susan Morrell and of Council Attorney Bob Sullivan, just so we know who's in the room.
Thank you. Thank you for attending. Great way to spend an evening.
Yeah.
So there was some talk about additional testing needing to be done. Do we have a sense of when that's going to happen?
I don't know who's that question for.
I guess that's for probably Skip or Drew.
Yeah, I can take a stab at that. There's a sampling program in place that's ongoing for semi-annual sampling. It includes groundwater, surface water, private wells. That's all done by CLG, so that's just continuous. There's also the work that's ongoing that Peter referenced with respect to what we call surface water, groundwater interaction. And that's kind of one piece that's missing some data. We know there's contaminants in surface water. We know some of it comes from the cap. We know some of it comes from groundwater discharging to surface water. It's just a matter of really zooming in on how much is coming from each of those sources that will help inform things like this pilot program and any future remedial actions that are maybe required. So I think that's the work that's happening now, and will be happening the next 6 months to a year.
If that's a new testing that needs to be done, what is the process for getting that done? I mean, does do you have to write up the specs? Do you have to put it out to bid? I mean, how long does it take before you actually have the data?
The work plan's in place. It was developed by CLG, approved conditionally by EPA and DES, and they're in the process of implementing that. I can't really speak to their inner workings on who they hired to do that or how much it costs, but that's, that mechanism is in place for getting it done.
When are you expecting the results?
It should be completed in about a year, but that does depend on I hate to say it, but on the weather. We've had some problems in the past with drought, and in those cases, we aren't able to sample. The surface water goes dry and we don't get samples. So, but if we continue to have normal rainfall, then it should be done within a year.
Has the sampling started?
Yes. Okay.
So it's an ongoing, okay.
That's right.
All right. We talked about a health risk assessment. What if that's something that we're going to do, what's the next step on that? And who's going to do that?
I can.
So I think there might be
Go
some
for it, John.
pause and confusion there because this is going to get really jargony. There's a public health assessment, which is something that Karen can answer, or there's a health risk assessment, which is getting back to the EPA risk assessors and their screening levels and all their magical acronyms. So are you meaning for EPA? Or are you meaning for local folks with trying to answer some of those health questions?
I'm gonna defer to my favorite scientist, Mindy Messmer, because she's the one that brought it up. Mindy, what did you have in mind?
Well, there was a comment made about petitioning, so we were planning to do that. And I think both are what we were talking about. So we would like to have follow-up on both avenues.
So what needs to
And
happen?
we can formalize, yeah, thanks, Chris. I was gonna say, if you guys need a formal request, we can do that.
We can consider this a request for the public health assessment right now, and I have your contact information, so I can reach out to you to set up a meeting so that we can discuss further.
So that
And Jonathan.
So is that for the health risk assessment? That's for the public health assessment, right? So what about the other one? What has to happen with that?
So I guess that's just more a question of when EPA can go through and evaluate their screening levels, determine what meets for their quality assurance with all that. So that's where I would defer over to Rich and the folks at EPA on sort of what their timeline is, recognizing that May is when they are going to update the calculator tool that those folks use. So saying that end of May sounds very ambitious from my own risk assessor perspective for having those all finalized. But I would defer to EPA for that one.
Well, as I said, and Courtney Carroll is joining in the human health risk assessor from EPA. We can, in fairly short order in May, recalculate our site-specific screening levels once we have the updated calculator and the data that we need. The evaluation of the risk is I'm not going to commit to doing that in May, but it can be done once we have those screening levels developed.
Yeah, exactly.
Fairly short order.
That's what I would say too. Like the screening levels are fairly easy to calculate once we confirm that the toxicity data and the parameters in the screening levels that are going to be published in May are all completed in the review and finalized. So once that happens, I think it'll be a fairly quick task to develop those site-specific screening levels. Whereas doing a second evaluation for the risk, that will take a little bit longer, but I imagine, this summer is definitely reasonable for doing that.
So is that like a Labor Day deliverable?
I would say probably sooner, but I wouldn't give a strict time frame just yet until I can get a look at the data. But I think in the next couple of months, certainly.
Okay. And then that going back to the public health assessment. So there'll be a, Karen, you're going to connect with Mindy about, getting together. How long does that take?
It depends on the scope of the assessment and whether it's a letter health consult, which is a shorter version of a health assessment that we do with our ATSDR funding, or a more formal, larger public health consultation, which will take, I don't know. I mean, I think the ones for Southern New Hampshire have been in process and in review for years now. So it is a lengthy process, just to be completely transparent and honest about it.
So Thanksgiving. I'm kidding.
That would be incredibly
I'm
ambitious.
I'm kidding.
I would love to be able to do that.
Yeah, okay. And is there funding? Do we know that there's funding? Is that going to be an issue?
So we do have a cooperative agreement with the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry right now. So that funds a health risk assessor, a principal investigator, and a health risk communicator. And it gives us access to work with team members at the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry. So we do have funding to do that sort of work.
I think just to be clear and not have any false expectations, that is not the same as like the PEAS health study that's being done, where health records are being pulled, people are being recruited into a study, hundreds of thousands of dollars are being spent on analysis. It's not that kind of assessment or study. Just to be clear, because I know we got confusion about that in the past. We'd love to have that money, but we don't.
And it's also not the same as a cancer cluster investigation. So I did include a link earlier in the chat about the cancer cluster investigation protocol that DHHS has put forward and who you can reach out to submit that sort of request.
So it's going to be really important to kind of finalize the scope of this study, because that could very easily determine whether there's money available or whether we got to get more money. Right?
Yes, but again, I think for like some of the health piece, that's something you can follow up with Karen and the Apple Tree group, either offline, or if you want to have folks, I think, come to a commission meeting. We're always happy to talk.
When do you think we could have the scope of that health assessment defined?
How soon are you all available?
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, I can email tomorrow morning to set up a meeting. Representative Muns, would you like to be included in that meeting along with Mindy Mesmer?
I certainly can. I'm going to add very little value. And I'm out of pocket for the next week. So I'd like to be invited, but don't hold it up for me.
Okay, I'll include you in it. Okay, Dr. LaPresto as well. I'll include you, and I wouldn't underestimate the value that you can add. It's helpful to hear about the concerns and questions that people have. So,
okay.
Dr. LaPresto, did you want to add something?
Yes, I just wanted to make sure that, to be clear, that the baseline human health risk assessment is directed more towards the EPA, and that evaluates current and future risks to human receptors, whereas what is being asked of the state through Karen and Dr. Patali is more or less looking at the past and the present, more or less the incidence. Is that correct in the distinction?
So we wouldn't be looking at it in terms of incidents. We'd be looking at like evaluating exposure, but not looking at any specific disease incidents. That would be outside of the scope of what a health consultation would be through ATSDR.
Mindy, I don't know if you have any comment on that, or okay, thank you.
I guess my last question, because I know it's getting late. My last question is, I think someone had talked about it. I don't know if it was you, Skip, or was you, Drew, that was talking about, you know, once we finished all the data collection, then we can start identifying, you know, remediation options. And I know that that's not something that's going to happen this month, next month, maybe even not this year. Realistically, what are we talking about? Are we talking about, you know, next year, the year after? I mean, what's the sense?
So I'll take a stab at that. Good question, and I think it's maybe two answers. One answer might be depending on, one answer might be depending on how the Coakley Landfill Group proceeds and you know, possible success at securing some of these loan monies to advance technology, you know, implementation of pilot technologies or full-scale technologies. The program's open to either for treating PFAS in surface water, stormwater at the site. So that could happen. You know, that award could be made probably within a year or about a year from now, if they succeed at securing that. So, and then based on that and the work that and data collection that's ongoing for surface water, groundwater interaction, that's going to inform remedial options to be considered, whether it be for cap runoff or for groundwater or surface water out in the wetland itself. Will inform that you know, design potentially to execute the plan that the CLG may put together. On the other side of it, and I'll let Skip speak to the timeline, and I think we've already addressed the timeline and some of the uncertainties there for actually updating risk considerations relative to the MCLs and toxicity, revised toxicity limits.
Yeah, I would, you know, I guess even couch it a little bit more as being not even wanting to speculate on a timeline for when a remedial action may be implemented or adjusted or taken on, because we don't know if we will get to that point yet. I mean, as we've discussed, where the program Superfund is driven by risk, unacceptable risk, and you know, we need to get to the point where we're evaluating that, and those interim steps that we're more confident in completing in the near term would be required before we even can think about what we're looking at for you know, for long-term solutions, if any are necessary. And that's, you know, that's from the Superfund program. That's kind of outside of the state grant program that they're undertaking. They may kind of dovetail each other at some point, but that's, you know, that's separate from what we'd be doing under Superfund.
Okay. And end the meeting now before I think of any more questions.
I was just about to say, I don't see any other questions in the chat or any hands raised, and we're a little bit after 8. So if everyone is good, we could end the meeting here, and I'll turn it over to Drew and Skip to any closing remarks.
Well, I'll jump in first. Thank you all for joining us. A great set of questions. I hope it was helpful and useful to you all. We will be posting our presentations collectively, and there is contact information there. And I think most of you do know how to reach us, you know, and certainly if there are others on the call within NHDES or EPA, reach out to Skip or I, and we can put you in touch with those individuals. We're happy to continue conversations or ask additional, you know, answer additional questions following the meeting.
If you could share with us the link to the YouTube That would be great.
We will definitely do that as well. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you all again for taking time out of your evening. I know it's above and beyond the call, but you know, that's, I guess, what we've come to expect of you guys, and you never disappoint. So thank you all very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Good
much.
questions.
Yep. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
you.
Good night.